Welcome to LV Scary Stories, where we dive into the most chilling encounters from those working closest to death. Morticians have a unique bond with the deceased, handling bodies, caring for loved ones, and sometimes experiencing things no one can explain. In today's video, we'll share 5 eerie tales from the people who care for the departed, stories where the dead seem to reach out in ways that linger far beyond the morgue. Whether it's an unsettling premonition or a final message from beyond, these stories will remind you that, for morticians, it's not always quiet in the presence of the dead. Story number 1. I'm a funeral director. I live in Los Angeles, where the population is very diverse. We accommodate different cultures and backgrounds as best we can. When I first started, I was still new and didn't have much seniority, so I often worked the night shift. This business is unpredictable. Sometimes we stay open late, even until 10 or 11 p.m., for family viewings. Our funeral home is large, and next to us is a cemetery. We always have at least 1 or 2 people staying on the premises, usually 2 for safety. One night, it was me and Josh. Josh was working on embalming a 62-year-old woman who had worked as a 911 dispatcher. She had recently died of heart disease. Many 911 dispatchers develop heart issues due to the stress of the job. When someone calls 911 in a panic or during an anxiety attack, those negative energies can transfer over to the dispatcher. Josh was working on the woman, and before finishing, he came out and told me he was going to grab something from Taco Bell before they closed. I told him, "Okay." About 10 minutes after Josh left, the phone rang. There was a phone by the main desk and another one in the prep room where the body was. I was expecting a call from a nursing home to pick up a body, so I started walking toward the main desk. But just as I reached it, the ringing stopped, as if someone had picked up the call. I thought Josh hadn't left and was still in the prep room, so I stopped. Then, clear as day, I heard a woman's voice say, "Hello, how may I help you?" I froze. That wasn't Josh's voice. I walked into the prep room where the woman's body was still lying on the table. The phone, just a few feet from the body, was hanging on the wall nearby. I felt chills. Then the phone rang again. This time I kept an eye on the body. After about 4 rings, I returned to the main room and answered the call. It was the nursing home, letting me know the body was ready for pickup. I waited for Josh to get back, which took about another 10 minutes, before heading to the nursing home. When I got there, I asked the nurse that called us, and she said the first time a lady answered her call, but it just went silence, so she had to hang up and call again. Hearing this sent another chill down my spine. But in this job, we know strange things happen, though we rarely talk about them. I picked up the body from the nursing home and brought it back to the morgue. Story number 2. I remember one night around 4 a.m., it was foggy, and a nurse called to request a body pickup. I answered and found out I was needed at a nursing home I'd visited many times, so I knew some of the staff there. After speaking with the nurse, I drove over by myself. When I arrived, I went into the room where the patient had passed. Fortunately, it was a small 87-year-old woman. She was lying in bed with her eyes closed. The nursing staff had already secured her jaw and head to keep her mouth closed and had tied her arms to her body and her legs together. I placed her in a white body bag, gently hugged her, and lifted her onto my gurney. I took her out to my vehicle and placed her in the back. I drove her back to our funeral home, which is located right next to a cemetery. It makes it easier to transport bodies for burial, being so close to the grounds. As I drove, it was about 5 a.m., and a thick morning fog had settled in. I could see the cemetery to my right through the haze. For some reason, the vehicle I was driving started acting up, as if it was about to run out of power. The car shook a few times, like it was going to stall. I didn't want it to break down in the middle of the foggy road, where other cars could easily hit me, so I pulled over to the side. When I stopped, I noticed the white body bag slowly sitting up. As a mortician, I'm not easily frightened, but the thick fog and the fact that I was parked by the cemetery gave me a bit of a chill. I climbed to the back of the van I was driving. Our funeral home uses vans to pick up bodies, which only have 2 seats in the front, leaving plenty of space in the back for transporting bodies. I unzipped the bag to check on her, and there she was, sitting up, her eyes wide open. I examined her closely to ensure she was truly deceased. I shined a penlight into her eyes and asked her name, but she didn't respond. I checked her pulse and listened for a heartbeat, but there was none. Her skin was pale with a yellowish hue, the way a dead person's usually is. I told her softly that I was going to zip the bag back up and lay her down, as we were almost there. I gently zipped up the bag and eased her back down. Once I arrived at the funeral home, I put her in the cold room with the other bodies. Let me tell you one thing. When you see a funeral home in a movie, you might see cabinets on the wall, each holding a body. But in reality, the bodies are often laid around the room, each bag labeled with the person's information and a tag tied to their toe. When it's time to work on a body, you go into the room and find the one you need. Story number 3. As a mortician, I don't mind the difficult parts of my job, but one of the saddest things is when a funeral involves a child. A child isn't supposed to die before their parents. One of my cases involved a young boy who was hit by a car while riding his scooter. Fortunately, the driver was caught by the police for reckless driving and driving without a license. The whole situation was tragic, though. The driver, a Mexican man, was really just trying to feed his family, who had arrived in the US about a year ago. Let's call the child who was hit Larry, to keep his real name private. Larry was his parents' only child. Early one morning, he slipped out without his parents noticing, as they were still sleeping. He went out on his scooter and, tragically, was hit by Jose, the driver, who was driving the wrong way on a one-way street. It was the middle of summer, and for those unfamiliar with this business, children tend to decompose faster due to their bodies having more water than adults. I remember when Larry's parents came in before I'd even had a chance to work on the body. I kept Larry's body in a very cold room and only opened the bag slightly so they could see his face. His arms and legs were badly injured, twisted and broken. The mother was inconsolable and looked like she might faint. Larry's father was deeply saddened too, and he even lifted his son in the body bag and carried him around the room. I stood outside watching through a window, and I nearly fell to my knees from the heartache of it all. After that, the night staff, who stayed to work on bodies or handle late calls, began saying they'd hear the voice of a boy crying and looking for his parents at night. They'd hear soft crying and sometimes him calling out for his mother and father. One night, I was there with a coworker when I heard it too. It was around 4 a.m. I'd been napping at my desk for about 20 minutes when my coworker Mike woke me and asked, "Did you hear that?" He was smiling. He'd heard it before. I listened, and sure enough, I heard the boy's voice softly crying and calling for his parents. It was more sad than scary. The next night, I wasn't working, but my coworker Mike had called Larry's father and told him about the cries. Around 8 p.m., Larry's father came by. There was no crying or calling that evening, but his father gently said, "Daddy's here, Larry. Come on, Daddy's taking you home." The father walked outside to his car, opened the back door, and waited for about a minute. Then he closed the door, got into the driver's seat, and drove back home. That night, the night staff didn't hear the boy anymore. When it came time for Larry's funeral, we brought his body out for the family. He looked peaceful, as though he were just sleeping, and he even appeared to be smiling. In my line of work, this was one of the few times I cried, feeling the depth of Larry's parents' heartbreak. Story number 4. There is a lot of gang violence in Los Angeles, particularly among Black and Latino gangs. The Asian gangs died down in the 90s, but Black and brown gangs are still very active. There are many shootings, and often we have to embalm a gang member who has died from gunshot wounds. As long as they aren't shot in the face, they're usually relatively easy to embalm. All you have to do is suture the wound and put a shirt over the body, and they generally look presentable. In my line of work as a mortician, people who die in car wrecks, from jumping off buildings, or from drowning, are the hardest to care for. Sometimes, the damage is so severe that even the most experienced mortician can't make the person look good. When that happens, we recommend a closed casket funeral, and usually the family agrees. One day, a body was brought in from a drive-by shooting. It was a Latino man named Carlos. He had been shot in the chest twice while standing outside his house, smoking a cigarette after an argument with his mother in the house. A few hours after we received the body, the family called to say they wanted to stop by and see Carlos, especially his friends and brothers. I patched the gunshot wounds with some cotton and sutured them shut. I left Carlos in the cold room. Once the family arrived, I left the room to let them be alone with Carlos. His mother was crying and kneeling on the floor, unaware of how unclean the floor was despite its shiny appearance. His relatives, brothers, and friends were all crying and visibly upset. These guys were also gang members, many covered with tattoos. One man named Manuel had a strange-looking black and red tattoo on his right cheek. At first, I thought it was a tattoo of an apple, but it wasn't. I could hear Manuel saying to Carlos, who was dead, "We're going to find out, Issei. We're gonna want you to come for the ride, too." I'm not into gang culture, but I understood their language. They were planning revenge, probably a drive-by shooting. After they looked at Carlos, they all left. When I returned to the room, the energy felt different. I could sense that the soul of Carlos was unhappy. I spoke kindly to Carlos, even though he was dead. We always try to show respect to the deceased, treating them as if they're still alive. By showing respect, the dead seem to make our job easier. Every mortician knows this, and every mortician talks to the deceased they're working on. You can ask any mortician, and they'll tell you that talking to the dead makes the work smoother. That same night, I was working late again. There were 2 other guys with me. I was preparing paperwork. One guy had gone to pick up a body, and the other was in the embalming room preparing a body for the next day's funeral. When the guy who went to pick up the body returned, it turned out to be Manuel. He was the guy I thought had a strange tattoo on his cheek that morning. That night, I learned that he had no tattoo on his cheek. Manuel had been shot, with the bullet entering one cheek and exiting the other. The entry wound on his left cheek was small, but the exit wound on his right cheek was badly damaged and torn. The cheek where the bullet exit has a wound that looks almost identical to what I thought was a tattoo earlier that day. The group had gone for a drive-by, and they shot 3 other people, but Manuel, sitting on the side of the car, was hit in the face. To this day, I still wonder, if what I saw that morning wasn't a tattoo, then what was it? It was one of the strangest things. It was as if something was foreshadowing Manuel's death and how he would die. The good thing is that the mortician who embalmed Manuel did an excellent job reconstructing his cheek. Story number 5. Even though my family and I are Christian, I've always made it a point to learn about other people's religion, culture, and history, especially since becoming a mortician and living in a very diverse city. In the Hmong culture, Hmong people don't cremate their deceased and can't bury them if there's any metal in or on the body. Even a pacemaker needs to be removed before burial. This belief ensures the spirit is able to move on peacefully. There was a case of a Hmong man who passed away at home, only 46 years old. He had a weak heart and was on dialysis. This man was also exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, which caused breathing complications during his life. When I arrived to pick up the body, the man's brothers and some elders had just shown up too. They were furious, yelling at his wife that the funeral needed to follow Hmong customs. The wife was of a different ethnicity, Maine, and their children were half Hmong, half Maine. Tensions were high in the house, so I told them to call me back once they settle things. Back at the funeral home, I was on lunch break, and at around 2 p.m. I briefly dozed off. In my dream, I received a phone call. The voice on the other end said, "Brother, someone is being hateful toward me and my family. Please help us." I woke up 2 minutes later, feeling strangely energized, and couldn't shake the dream. At 5 p.m., the family called, and I returned to find the house a mess, holes in the walls and objects thrown around. The man's wife and daughters were crying, visibly distressed. The son, Davy, handed me a tape, explaining that his father's last wishes were recorded on it. They'd already dressed him in traditional funeral clothes, so I placed him in the van, and on the drive back, I played the tape. To my surprise, the voice on the tape matched the one in my dream. He spoke in English, expressing sadness that his family had never visited him during his long illness. He asked his children to honor their mother's culture instead of a traditional Hmong burial, and to cremate him, so he wouldn't be born Hmong in his next life. Listening to his voice, I understood why his brothers had been so angry. Later, at the funeral home, I began the embalming process, making 2 incisions to insert tubes that push embalming fluid through the body. As I worked, I noticed something strange. A small sewing needle lodged beneath his big toenail. Hmong believe that any metal left in a body can trap the soul, preventing it from moving on. When the soul cannot move on, the soul will come back and cause harm and sickness to his children. Now, I understood the dream. He was asking me to remove this last barrier. I removed the needle. On the day of the funeral, I prepared his body for the service and then carried out his final wish, cremating him. I hope his family found peace, as he wished, and that they learned to support each other in the face of loss, not let anger take over. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.